Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I see so many familiar names on here and a lot of other folks. We have a pretty good turnout, so super excited for having you all and joining us today on a Friday. Nia T, if you want to bring up the slides when you get a chance, that'd be great. So welcome, I'm Tom Cogswell. I'm with the OHA Transformation Center. If you're not familiar with us, we are an office within the Oregon Health Authority. And one of the things that we do is we provide support to CCO Community Advisory Council members, including things like this learning session. This session, you can go to the next slide, UT, is part of a learning series that is focused on the social determinants of health and equity. And we'll get more into that in a second. We have a little bit of delay in getting some of our interpreters set up. So once I turn it over to our presenter, I will get that set up and add instructions into these instructions into the chat. But just so you know what's coming, we do have closed captioning available, which you can select at the bottom of your screen, and that'll be available in a couple minutes. We'll have American Sign Language ASL interpretation available, and then I included links here for others. Coordinators who may expect any Spanish-speaking CAC members will drop that information in the chat as well. Okay, you can go to the next slide. I think there's one back. Maybe we lost one.
We might have lost one.
That's okay. I don't need a slide. It's all good. I just wanted to, before we jump in, provide a little quick background. Why this topic of applying an equity lens and reviewing community spending requests. So there's a requirement that CCOs must create some kind of rule for CAC members in reviewing spending that covers the social determinants of health and equity. And when we say talk about social determinants of health, we're really talking about those conditions that people are born into, live, work, everything from education, transportation, those sort of things. And so there's two real mechanisms that CCOs can do this. One is called health-related services, and another is called the SHARE Initiative, Supporting Health for All through Reinvestment. And don't worry about jotting this down. We'll share this as a follow-up, including the slide that was originally in here around kind of the definitions. The bottom line is that many of you may have been involved so far in reviewing some kind of request from your community for spending. And in many cases, this might be attached to your community health improvement plan. And so we wanted to kind of take a step back, and because of this focus on equity in the series, we thought this was a great opportunity to really look at what are some tools and strategies to help you if you're involved in reviewing those requests to make sure that equitable decisions are made. And so the first thing we wanted to do is if you have had a role so far in reviewing any kind of spending requests for the social determinants of health and equity, we'd love it if you would share that in the chat. Whether that's, actually reviewing spending requests or maybe designing some kind of rubric that your CAC is using. And we understand that maybe not all CAC members have had this opportunity yet, but if you have had a role, we'd love to hear a little bit in the chat what that's looked like. And then we'll come back to the phone in a second. Okay, so I just typed this question in the chat. Great, I see some responses coming in. And while we do this, I'm going to go ahead and assign our closed captioner. Okay, thank you everyone for sharing. I see a lot of great suggestions coming in. Is there anyone that's just joined via the phone that would like to share what their role has been?
I can share. This is Buffy Hurtado. I'm the tribal liaison for Pacific Source, all regions.
Yeah, go for it.
I'm just currently trying to work with all of my regions in understanding the tribal engagement and participation on their CACs. So I'm just here to listen to what it is you guys are suggesting about equitable conversations, because I think it really pertains to the work that I do.
Great, thanks, Buffy. We're glad we could join. Okay, anyone else on the phone like to share before we go ahead and transition to our presenter? Okay, so I am pleased to introduce Niyati Desai from the Oregon Community Foundation, who will be our main presenter for today. And Niyati, hopefully those examples in the chat gave you a good sense from our group here that's today, about a little over 50 people, many of which are CAC members, of how they've been involved so far. So I will turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Can you all hear me okay?
Yep.
I'm seeing some heads, great. Great, well, those examples were excellent. Great to see it, because I think it'll be this presentation and our conversation today will be really useful, I hope, for you all as we move forward in this work. So I am Niyati Desai. I use she, her pronouns. My title is Director of Community Engagement at the Oregon Community Foundation, otherwise known as OCF to many folks in the community. And just a little bit of background, my role here at OCF is to oversee and I support a statewide team focused on community impact and community engagement. And so in short, we aim to listen, learn, and respond to a wide range of community needs facing diverse populations across all regions in the state. So one relevant example of how we do this is our statewide community grants program. For example, in 2021, we saw record-breaking numbers of applications. So we received about 1,300 applications. We engage community volunteers, about a network of 100 volunteers to engage in this review process. So our review process is always evolving, and we are also on a journey to figure out how best to integrate equity into our review process. So by no means have we got this perfect. We're always learning, growing, and evolving, and I hope this inspires you to do the same. So I'm really honored to be with you all today. We're gonna have a discussion about how to apply an equity lens when the CACs are reviewing community spending requests. And here's what our agenda looks like. We'll review what an equity lens is, why it matters in the application review process. We'll engage in an exercise to understand our own biases and why it's important that we acknowledge those as we review applications. And then finally, I'm going to share some examples of how to implement an equity lens in the review of spending requests. This will pertain to both scoring rubrics in the actual review process and in the decision-making or the recommendation setting. And then we'll open it up for questions and answers. Zoom is hard to do this. I would typically have Post-it notes all over the place, and we would be engaging and interacting. So please, I want to hear from you throughout the presentation. Please feel to unmute, ask your questions, engage in dialogue, share examples of how you've done some of these things, or pop questions in the chat, and Tom can help me in reading those out. I do recognize it is 12 o'clock, the lunch hour. We are all busy and hungry people, so please feel free to eat during this time as well. All right, well, just what Tom was sharing, and I wanted to just put this up here as well, but as a reminder, this topic was included in your series because it's a requirement for the Community Advisory Councils to play a role in reviewing CCO spending related to social determinants of health and equity, including the health-related services, community benefit initiatives, and the SHARE initiative. So my understanding is each CCO will or has defined the role that the CAC will play. So you may already, we heard from the chat, many of you are already actively engaged. Some of you are probably still in development. But some of the examples of what your role might include is identifying or approving the social determinants of health and equity priorities that are in line with the community priorities in the community health plan. The CAC might review SHARE initiative related proposals and make recommendations to the CCO leadership and board. The CCO might designate a portion of the funding for you all to direct to SHARE initiative efforts. And another example is that the CAC might track or monitor the outcomes of the SHARE initiative spending. So we'll spend today with this background and context in the various roles that you might be playing as it relates to the CCO. So let's begin. Let's dive into what an equity lens is and why it matters in the review process. To start, I'd like to start with OHA's definition of health equity. And when we think of this definition in the context of reviewing spending requests, it's really a goal to ensure that a community's characteristics or the social determinants of health do not provide either an advantage or a disadvantage related to their ability to access available resources. We have all likely seen variations of this image. What it does is aim to depict the difference between an equality approach versus an equity approach. This is from Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. One of their campaigns calls "One Size Does Not Fit All." So what this suggests is that in order to move towards an equity approach, we must work to acknowledge and address barriers to achieving health. In our application review, this would suggest that not all community efforts, the organizations that serve them, the approaches they propose, those are not all equal, and that it's really important to consider the context of the organization, the community of which they're aiming to serve, and the proposed work when we review the potential effectiveness or impact of those proposals. So let's consider what happens when we use a one-size-fits-all approach to a grant review. An equality approach treats all applications, all organizations, and all communities the same. It often does not have a stated priority related to the communities we're aiming to serve, marginalized communities, or a clear, distinct, or explicit focus on disparities. An equality approach also doesn't typically have a nuanced or flexible definition of what we mean by success or impact. How do we define effectiveness? What does that look like for that community or that proposal or that organization? And finally, it doesn't consider the current climate that we're in, the cultural or historical context in which this issue is arising and the communities that are being served, or the organization's history and their ability and track record supposedly with addressing these needs. So what often results from an equality approach is that nonprofit organizations or organizations and agencies that are led by and serving people of color and marginalized communities receive significantly less money and fund and investment than those led by white or dominant culture counterparts. These investments end up reinforcing or perpetuating inequities and the disparities, the very ones we're all trying to overcome through this effort. So what is an equity lens in the context of application review? I want to just start by saying I do not love the word lens. It is a very commonly used term, and so we'll use it here today. But to me, it does suggest something that it might be optional, something that could be applied or not applied, and something versus something that should be well integrated into our work or standard practice. But like I said, since it's commonly used in an understood term, will you go with it today? So an equity lens supports reviewers in considering the potential benefits or the unintended consequences on an impacted population. When you use an equity lens in application review, it gives you a process for analyzing or diagnosing the impact of the proposed approach, so through that spending request, on underserved or marginalized individuals and populations. An equity lens also means that you are explicitly or deliberately including marginalized populations in your work. You have an intentional focus on race, ethnicity, or other community characteristics, which we'll define in just a little bit. So communities of color and Indigenous communities and other marginalized communities, what we know is they experience striking levels of poverty and other social and economic disparities. The causes are often rooted within deeper historical context of trauma, financial instability, and other barriers based on racial discrimination, which make it much harder for them to thrive in their own terms. So in addition to an equity lens, there's a well-justified movement to specifically address racial equity. The Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity published a report called Grant-Making with an Equity Lens. Here, it shows you that there's 4 important features of an equity lens. And I'll give you a moment to read that. So this approach separates symptoms from causes.
I'm sorry, excuse me. I am the interpreter for your meeting. I'm sorry I'm been late because I was waiting for the link.
Sure, I'll turn it over to Tom, who can help you.
Okay, sure, thank you.
Okay, we'll keep going. I think Tom will be the one working with you. Thank you. So recently, the same group published a follow-up report, which is focused on racial justice lens. This approach aims to do racial equity, the 4 qualities or features of a racial equity lens, as well as a racial justice lens. So what this does is it takes it a step farther, really thinking about power and privilege, a real intentional aim to redistribute resources to advance equity, and a focus on systemic or transformative change. So I'll give you a moment to read this as well. So it is important to remember that equity is both a process as well as an outcome that we seek to achieve. CCOs are encouraged to consider community spending requests that aim to address disparities and close the gaps related to the social determinants of health, with the goal of improving the health of marginalized groups. When we think about how we measure equity or health equity, it's typically progress towards it is typically assessed by measuring how have these disparities changed over time. So what we know is that not all communities are the same, and therefore not all the needs, the disparities, the solutions will also be the same. We know that nuances exist in all of our communities, and it's important to have clarity on the impact that your CAC aims to have through these investments. So one strategy that you all might engage in is to define specifically what your region means by marginalized, by excluded, or by impacted communities. As a general definition, marginalized communities might refer to groups and communities that experience discrimination and exclusion because of unequal relationships across economic, political, social, and cultural dimensions. So to advance equity and demonstrate to the community that you are employing a clear equity focus, CCOs and CACs might decide to prioritize selected priority needs or specific populations. And what I'm here to say is really to encourage you for this to be a collaborative and community engaged process. You want this to resonate with the communities you aim to serve. And the more engaged they are throughout the process, the deeper accountability and involvement they will have in the success of the initiative. I'm sharing with you a list of ways that you might define marginalized or impacted populations in your community or the region that you serve. This by no means is a comprehensive list, but really demonstrates the breadth of what you might consider from a population perspective. We know each CAC represents different communities, and the community health assessments that you all have done include disparities for your community. So we encourage you to refer back to your community health assessments to look at that and think about, based on those disparities, who's most impacted, which populations, which groups, which communities. We know that you all represent a range of geographies, urban, rural, and frontier, and that diversity and equity is applicable across a wide range of demographics or characteristics. I think when we talk about equity, it's often associated or linked to race, racial equity, like we just talked about. But equity can be applied in relationship to many other characteristics as indicated here. So income levels, gender, occupations, and more. So in short, I really encourage you to have a localized, community and culturally specific approach. This is always much more effective and impactful in your reviews and in the investments that you make than a one-size-fits-all approach or an equality approach.
Niati, before I go to the next slide, there was one question in the chat. I don't know if you saw that.
No, sorry, it's hard for me to read the chat, and
oh, good. Question was, what would be a better term to use besides lens?
Yeah.
There was one suggestion was perspective given in the chat, so just wanted to share that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know that there's a better term, to be honest. We use the same term at OCF, an equity lens. And I think that it can just be interpreted in different ways and it can be applied in different ways. So I don't know that we've landed on what's the better term to use, but I just want everyone to be mindful that when we say lens, we're really indicating that let's apply it universally. Let's apply it across the board, and let's all get to a shared understanding about exactly what it is we mean. Because without that, you have differing ways of applying that lens, differing inconsistent ways in which it's being used or defined. And so that's a lot of the work behind the scenes that needs to take place in order to have an effective equity lens. But I appreciate the question. And like I said, this field is evolving alongside all of you and your journeys. And so we're always learning and growing. And this is one space where that particular term has just sat with me in different ways as I've seen it be implemented inconsistently over time. A great question. All right, so thank you, Tom, for please do keep popping these questions up as they show up. So next, I'd like to revisit the topic of bias with you all. I understand some of you have participated in a training, an OHA delivered training around unconscious bias. And today will be a bit of a refresher for those of you that did that. But we're also going to engage in an exercise to just demonstrate how bias shows up and its implications in an application review. So what is bias? Bias is a tendency to favor a thing, a person, a group, or a situation compared to one another, and it's usually in a way that's unfair. So although bias comes with a negative connotation, it's important to know that we are all biased. We were all raised in different places. We all came from different families. We all have different belief systems, different values. We've had different experiences in life. We have different practices, and we have all had different opportunities. So biases emerge from how we were raised, what we've heard, or what we've been told, or what we've experienced in life. So there's many types of biases, but the two I'll focus on first is conscious bias. And this is really an overt or intentional attitude about a group or population. This is often the person is aware of the bias that they have. This could be racism or sexism, discrimination, stereotyping, etc. What often shows up in application review is what we call unconscious or implicit bias. So these are really associations made between different qualities and social categories without being aware. It's a really reflexive assessment. We all do it all day long. It's immediate, and it's something that we want to be aware of and take into consideration as we are reviewing spending requests. I like this quote, which really kind of sums it up, which is research shows that our racial biases are often more about who we choose to help than who we don't. And we tend to help people who are similar to us. So I'm going to engage you. Please indulge me in a bit of an activity. I'm going to ask you to take out a pen and a piece of paper, or you can use the chat. I'm going to display a series of words. I'll display them for about 5 to 10 seconds each. After each word, I just want you to list or describe as many associations as that come to you that you absorb throughout your life. These are often one-word things like tough, strong, smart, unprofessional, unreliable, kind. Sharing at the end will be optional. I won't be asking you to share your exact association, so don't feel nervous or concerned about that. And in the same way, these are your own, so please don't edit or try to correct your immediate associations, although it's good practice to be aware, and we'll get to that. So I'm going to move to the next slide, and I will spend about 10 seconds per word. Again, just write a list of the associations that come to you based on each word that I display. First word is farm worker. The next word is veteran. The next word is immigrant. The next word is single mother. The next word is teacher. The next word is disabled or differently abled.
Is there a reason they don't use the term alter-abled?
No, thank you. There is many different terms, so I will include that. Thank you. The next term is houseless person. And the last word is doctor. All right, so not to move you along too quickly, but given the time we have together, I would love to just open it up, take a minute to process. I would love to hear from you all. How was that exercise for you? What did you learn about yourself? What surprised you by that activity, or anything else you'd like to share? Please don't be shy.
Beth, I see
Hi.
it. Yeah, go ahead, Beth.
Hi, yeah. So what really surprised me, I'm going to start at the bottom and work my way back up. I drew a total blank on doctor.
Yeah.
Just total blank.
Yeah.
But what comes to what my responses reflect is not surprising, because I do work with the houseless population and we do social service navigation, healthcare navigation services. So most of the theme was, strong, resilient, empathetic, compassionate, tough, all the way down the line. Resilient popped up quite a bit. For the disabled, courage and perseverance were two very strong, came to me. I've worked with that population and have personal experience my entire life, just about, with that population. So, so that was my feedback. And the exercise as a whole is a nice reminder, for me anyway. I've been doing some equity work in Curry for a while now, and with Oregon Health Authority Public Health Division. So yeah, I'm glad that I'm far enough along in this process that I can see the strength and resilience in a lot of these.
I was going to say, it's beautiful. Thank you for sharing. And I'm noticing that a lot of your associations are positive and encouraging. And so it's clear that you've had experience with these populations in these groups. And I don't want to speak for everyone, but I'm assuming not everyone has that same experience. And we all come from different walks and have different interactions with all of these different kind of groups and populations. But I appreciate your share. Thank you. How about anyone else?
I saw Kimberly had her hand raised. Kimberly, you can go ahead.
Yeah, so can y'all hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I'm going to start at the bottom, and I am just a community member. I'm not, I don't work for an agency. And I'm just going to share my personal experience.
Please.
As far as doctor, I just put that I just rely on my doctor for helping me with physical stuff and medications, and it's become a struggle because I think a lot of doctors are now controlled by other agencies, and it's sad that they can't just do what doctors used to do. So I won't go into details. Houselessness, I actually experienced this myself in 2009. And I can say from 2009 until today, not a lot has changed. And it's very sad that a lot of people are biased. The people are biased towards people that are houseless or homeless, however you want to say it. And, you know, a lot of us struggle to try to help these people and not have them be in that predicament. So I guess all we can do is just continue to try. And then I'm not going to go into every box, but the other thing about disabled, different abled, myself, I struggle with help. I am getting help. We need more community help. We need, a lot of times I think people look down on disabled, a lot of times classify disabled people as trying to not help themselves and just have a handout. They just want everything given to them, and that's not necessarily true. And it is sad that there are a lot of people that take advantage. There's a lot of fraud. So it's a struggle to defend yourself, so to speak. And then teachers are valuable. I think single mothers struggle, need more help. Immigrants, I've always thought immigrants was good for our whole community. It gives us diversity. And then farm workers are so valuable. You know, we need these people to get our food, you know, and I've always respected farmers and the field workers and, you know, stuff like that. So that's my opinion. That's a lot of stuff I've struggled with, but yeah, I think these are important.
Thank you, Kimberly. I really appreciate that. And thank you for your honest and vulnerability there with some of those personal shares. And, you know, what you've kind of demonstrated is both the need in the community, but also how the perception of some of these community groups are. And if we don't kind of check that perception in our review, that it can come up quite a bit. Thank you. Anyone else want to share? I see a hand up. Michelle?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that when I was doing this exercise, one thing that really got to me was I struggled to differentiate between my thoughts and society's thoughts on a specific subject. Like, for instance, we'll go immigrant. I personally think of dreamer, driven, but you've got that societal voice in your head saying freeloading, and for instance, houseless, lost, burdened, scary, whereas I look of determined, driven, and dreamer as well. So I really
I think we lost your audio.
Yeah, my cat, sorry, she just turned off my audio. But like I was saying, I just struggle with what I feel compared to what society feels. That was very, very poignant for me. And I struggled with that in this exercise. So that was enlightening for me.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. And I think, you know, as we're thinking about ourselves as either individual reviewers of these spending requests or in a collective, in a group setting, how do we both check our own as well as hear from others, and also call out if things are maybe not equitable, or we're not seeing a equity lens being applied in the review of these spending requests. So anybody else before we move on? Thank you so much, Michelle.
I see Don, hand raised.
What I was surprised was the number of times one of the first words that came to my mind was trauma. These were people who have experienced and are experiencing trauma in their life, and that is a shaping factor. And I found myself again and again with those, as well as the positive ones that somebody mentioned in terms of most people hardworking, having to work harder to get less.
Right. Great point. Great point, Don. And that trauma, I think, is pervasive when we think about impacted, marginalized, excluded. How does that show up for those communities? And then how are we considering that when we review the applications or the spending requests we see? There's a lot of movement to support organizations that are led by or serving the folks that they are aiming to serve. So having representation. And we'll get into this in just a bit. So I'm going to move us along, seeing the time here. But if you have anything else to add, I encourage you to share that in the chat. Thank you for all your shares. Those were great. So when we think about bias and review and how this shows up and might show up in your community and in your own CAC exercises, you know, a bias application process, it's both inequitable, and it basically could result in certain communities not having the same access to the resources that they well deserve. Here's some 5 sources of bias in the application review. The first is affiliation bias. I'm going to share some data with you, which is reviewers tend to favor top-ranked institutions or well-established organizations and or leaders at about 15% higher than other organizations. So folks that are well-known, well-established in the community, versus those that are not. The next is conflict of interest bias. And this is what the research shares, is that applications are 4 times more likely to receive a higher score if there's some connection to the reviewer. Structural bias. This is a big one and something we look at OCF quite a bit, especially in the community grants program, which is basically a preference for applications that have received funding. There's some research that shows that about 70% of first-time funding seekers have to resubmit at least once before being funded. So you think about these organizations, especially smaller, rural, grassroots, volunteer-led types of organizations or efforts, and the amount of work that they put into these requests, and how are we defining what success looks like? What does that mean? How are we taking this into consideration as they move forward? Oftentimes, some of these smaller organizations don't have an on-staff application writer or grant writer. This might be the first spending request they've ever put in. So how do we take that into consideration? The next is gender bias. So women leaders are 30% less likely to be funded compared to male leaders. And then race or ethnicity bias. The research shows that Black and African-American applicants received awards at about 13 points less than other races. So one strategy that some folks implement, we haven't done it at OCF, it's challenging to do, but one strategy that is suggested is to minimize bias is to actually conduct anonymous reviews. So you don't actually know who the organization is, where they're located, who they're from, and really you're just reviewing them based on the quality of the application or what they're proposing. So that's considered an anonymous review process. It really takes out the element of some of these biases that you have listed in front of you. Okay, so in this next part of the presentation, and then we're going to hopefully have plenty of time for questions, we will be focusing on how to apply this lens in reviewing spending requests. So why equity matters in our review. I'm going to hit this home again, but essentially it's to ensure appropriate proportion of investments are going to those communities that are most impacted by any given issue. So not all efforts or organizations are the same. Here are some range of criteria. So as you're developing rubrics and thinking about scoring, here's some areas that you might consider based on those spending requests. And we'll go into each of these in detail. But eligibility, the community that's being served, the organization's track record of success, the budgets of the organization's leadership, their staffing, or their capacity to do the work they propose, the partnerships that they have, relationships with the community served or the level of community support, and the organization's own journey with diversity, equity, and inclusion. So let's dig into each of these. So when we think about eligibility, what each slide will have this, it's a kind of a continuum from almost an equality or a kind of non-equity lens all the way to a kind of more formal or well-established equity lens. So when we think about eligibility, typically, and some folks might have limitations on who they can fund, and that's completely understandable. OCF is like that. We might only fund 501c3 IRS tax exempt nonprofits only. What we know about the nonprofit status and being able to access that designation is it's lengthy, it's time consuming, it requires a lot of legal support to get there. Oftentimes the efforts in the organizations most rooted in community are grassroots, they're small, they're volunteer led or run. So they might need fiscal sponsorship, meaning they have another organization or agency that's applying on behalf of them. So a shift toward equity would really be to include nonprofits as well as fiscally sponsored organizations, which is something that OCF does. A step even farther is to think about funding nonprofits, fiscally sponsored organizations, as well as other things, co-ops, coalitions, movements, mutual aid, those without a legal IRS tax exempt status. And I don't know the exact restrictions or requirements within the CCO, but something to consider. Where on the continuum are you? What are you looking at? How are you considering this? We think about equality, an equity approach within eligibility. We really want to expand what types of organizations or efforts can access the available funding. Okay, so the next category you might be considering when you review in your rubric or in your scoring is who's being served, who's the community, who's the population that's being served. All the way to the left is a one-size-fits-all or a colorblind approach, as they call it. Somewhere in the middle is where there's a targeted focus. We know we want to serve organizations, we know we want to serve communities that are marginalized or impacted. And so some of our funding is going to go to those groups. We're going to make sure we take that into consideration, but it's not necessarily a must. And then farther down the line is majority of funding might go to organizations that are not just serving communities, but have representation. So they are also led by those groups. They have lived experience in those communities. So an equity approach, when we think about community population served, it's really about who are we prioritizing? Are we just saying money, funds can go to all, or do we really want to designate either a certain portion of the funding to a specific disparity community or group as defined by the CAC or the CCO? Who is most impacted? How do you want to move the needle in this space? Okay, staffing and leadership. This one is been coming up a lot, especially in the work that I do, and it's hard to track, I will say. So all the way to the left is really kind of a status quo investment, right? You're funding organizations whose grantsmanship is perfect. You can tell that they have a grant writer on staff. It's a well-crafted proposal. They have a well-established staffing structure. You aren't necessarily reviewing the relationship between the staff and the population served. So you're just really going based on the infrastructure that they have in place. And because they have that infrastructure, they're worthy of an investment. But what we know historically is that funds have been prioritized for white dominant culture organizations, well-established organizations. So they have grown their staff, they've grown their capacity, they've grown their expertise. And that doesn't always necessarily, doesn't always mean that they're the best to serve that particular community. So just something to take into consideration. In the middle is you have some targeted focus on funding organizations who have varied experience in grant writing. So maybe they had some grammatical errors in their application. Maybe they didn't answer all of the questions. Is there a follow-up conversation that you could have to answer some of those questions? Maybe they don't have as much experience in writing, in submitting spending requests. So that's one thing to consider. Another is staffing and leadership and capacity to engage in the work is considered, but not required. So we want to make sure there's some representation or some relationship between who's doing the work and the community being served, but it's not required. And then all the way to the end is that you want to prioritize organizations who have representation. Sorry for the typo there, that they have representatives of the population served. And you're not really overly concerned with the staffing structure sorry, I lost some words on this one. The staffing structure, a lot of the smaller grassroots rural-based organizations that are doing incredible work in the community, the person that's doing the books is also doing, the service is also doing, the volunteer coordination is also doing, you name it. So folks are stretched. So when you think about the structure, when you think about who's actually leading the work, it's important to consider who's best suited for that particular work. In addition to, you want to make sure the organization is reliable, of course, but some things to consider. So when you think about staffing and leadership, to what degree do you want to require representation from the community on that particular proposal? Do you have a preference for culturally specific organizations in your investments? Okay, this next one is a track record of success. This is something that OCF has been, we are actively working on. We have, and I'll be very transparent, we have had a history of funding well-established, well-funded organizations. So what we're seeing here is kind of a continuum. And what we know, let me back up and say, is that it takes funding to build capacity. If you don't get funding, it's hard to build capacity. So if we look at how investments have been made historically, we know that dominant culture, status quo, big, well-known organizations are going to have the capacity. They're going to have the track record of success. They're going to have the demonstrated outcomes that you're hoping to see. But when you think about smaller grassroots rural organizations, BIPOC-led organizations, they might not have that track record of success. And so how do you take those into consideration? You really want to think about who's best suited to do this work. So this continuum is fund. We only fund well-established organizations. Somewhere in the middle is funding them. We fund them, but we also fund a few other things. And then farther down the line is we're really thinking about how are we supporting these smaller grassroots orgs? How are we making sure that the ones that are culturally specific, those that are run by volunteers but are deeply rooted in community, are accessing these resources? So again, an intentionality to fund those smaller grassroots, non-traditional organizations or efforts, regardless of the comparative capacity or history of success. We do a mix of this, so we absolutely continue to fund well-established organizations who are well-suited to do the work, but in some cases, they're not the best suited to do the work that they're proposing. And so we look to see if there are other organizations or there are other efforts. Over the last 2 years during the pandemic, we have seen an incredible rise in community grassroots efforts that are really rooted and trusted in community. And we want to really think about how are we best serving those organizations or efforts. Okay, budget. Budget is a big one. It kind of ties into all of what we've talked about already. Are we only funding those that are well funded? Do they have all of the other funding already in place? Do you require matching or other funding in order to get the funding, in order to get this the spending from the CCOs? Somewhere in the middle is you don't require that matching or other funding, but you want to limit how much of their, so say they have a $100,000 operating reserve, you're only going to fund 10, 20% of their total burn, their work, or a percentage of the project cost. So where are you on that continuum? And then farther down the line is funding organizations. They might not have the operating reserves. They might not have the capital in place. They might not have a long history of successful funding, but they're best suited to do the work. And so where are you on that continuum? How are you considering some of these newer emerging grassroots efforts in your work?
Would you be able to just speak real quick to what you mean by operating reserves?
Oh yeah, thank you so much. So some,
quick time check. You have about 5 minutes.
Okay, great. Okay, I'm gonna breeze through this. So operating reserves is essentially the funds that they have set aside in case of emergency, in case things don't move forward, in case other funding doesn't come through. So they have some cash reserves that allows them to fill in the blanks or gaps if anything comes up. We know that well-established organizations often have this, and we know that small organizations, scrappy organizations, typically do not have these cash reserves. Communities of color led by organizations, indigenous serving organizations often do not have these level of cash reserves. So thank you for the question. So is that a requirement essentially that you're looking at when you make decisions? Or can you say, hey, they haven't been funded, they've been successful in their work, but they don't have a lot of reserves, but we're gonna move forward. So what I put here is really an increase in risk tolerance. Well, how are you defining risk? What does it mean to invest in an organization that maybe doesn't have the track record or the budget that other well-established organizations have? Okay, I'm gonna try to go fast so we can move through, but community support and capacity to do the work. This is really important. So all the way to the left here, supporting orgs who say they work with marginalized community, but there's not really a gut check. Do they truly, are they trusted in the community? Are they the ones that the community goes to for their given needs? So this is tricky to track, and this is where community engagement becomes really important. It's easy to check a box and say you're serving these communities, but how are we double checking that? How are we gut checking that? Somewhere in the middle is considering their history of working with that given population. maybe this is year 2, maybe this is year 3, maybe they're just developing these relationships, but there's some letters of support in there. They've gotten some of the, the support from the community that they're aiming to serve. And then all the way to the right is funding those that have those trusting relationships. They've demonstrated that they've worked with these communities in the long term. They're not just checking a box, so to speak. It requires demonstrated representation within and across the organization. So again, it's shifting how we define success. Is it just about trusting what they say, or is it also demonstrating what is the level of support they have from the community? What's the quality of that relationship? Have they demonstrated they have trust with that community and they're going to be successful in the work that they're proposing? Okay, last one, org's equity journey. So again, new, we haven't implemented this at OCF, but it's something that we've talked about a lot and we're beginning to implement in our community grants program. But really understanding where the organization is, we know we're all on different journeys. Not every organization is going to have the representation to serve a given community, and that's not necessarily a requirement. They can still be a very trusted organization. But where are they on that when they talk about equity? Are they actually considering and thinking about this? So all the way to the left, doesn't review an org's experience. We are not assessing for their actions related to diversity, equity, or inclusion. Somewhere in the middle is, we're asking some questions where we want to learn. Where are they? What are they doing? What do they have in place? What's worked? What's been challenging? And this is kind of where we are at OCF. And then all the way to the right requires organizations to demonstrate a commitment. So they have a stated commitment, they have stated goals, they have leadership policies and practices and action. So again, thinking about, is this something you want to assess or evaluate when we're looking at the organizations that are coming forward for requests? I'm just going to say here, this last point, which is, in this phase, we really are no longer in a place to accept this idea that DEI doesn't apply in my community. So diversity, equity, inclusion. When we hear that, it's a red flag. So we know that as we talked about marginalized communities, this isn't just about race and ethnicity, though that we know that applies across all communities. This is about equity in many different senses of the word. So how is it being applied within this particular organization? Okay, well, we only have a few minutes, so I'm going to skip this exercise. The last slide here, but really what it was is, which of these practices do you want to explore and implement with your CAC? So I'll let you think about that, maybe some homework to take to your next meeting. I'm going to not spend time on this because I do want a couple minutes for questions, but what I put here is a couple next steps for you to consider. Do you want to define marginalized communities? Do you want to re-examine what you mean by effective or impactful? Do you want to set some goals around this work? And lastly, number 7 is really important, which is this work is really messy. It's really hard. It's important to have conversation and acknowledge and address the tensions that exist. Having productive disagreement is good. It means you're working, it means you're pushing yourself, it means you're challenging yourself. So I'll stop there. I'm so sorry we ran so short on time. Obviously I could talk about this all day long. So open it up for any questions or thoughts. I'm seeing a hand from Kimberly.
Yeah, so I have kind of a funny question. On the information for the grants, like I don't know if there's like applications or something, and how you were talking about, how to prevent bias or have grant applications looked at a certain way based on like who's sending it in. So why don't they just take that race box off everything? Take it off the applications, take it off, stuff they collect, and then that way that race box isn't looked at.
Well, I think it's because it's really important, one, for tracking. We don't have a great way. I don't think anyone's figured out how to demonstrate who is being served in the community. The checkboxes is a really simplistic way of doing that. But what I was suggesting is there needs to be additional checks and balances against those checkboxes. Checking, we want to confirm that there's relationships, there's trust, there's support from the community in this proposal. So but we all know we need to track and report out on who's being served. So without a really perfected way of doing that. That is typically how it's done. And what I was saying in the anonymous review is you could remove all of that, and you could just have the qualitative pieces being reviewed, and then share at the end, here's how these organizations stood out. So that is definitely something that folks practice.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. If you took that race box out of the initial part of the process, and then once they get to the end or whatever, then they can still collect that data needed, you know, for race or whatever, still collect that data and make sure that things are being served. But then, you know, like you said, that the person reviewing, a lot of times their grant or whatever might be favored if it's something similar to what that person likes.
Yeah. And that's why I encourage team-based reviews, right? Versus individual reviews, deliberating, having conversation. We do this at OCF, and it really has changed the quality of the recommendations moving forward. I know we're at time. I don't know, Tom, if folks can see on. I see Beth has a question, but I can also put my email in the chat, and I'm happy to follow up too.
Yeah. Are you able to quickly pull up your slides and go to the last slide by chance?
Let's do that.
I think, so I included my way to contact me in the chat, and we'll send a follow-up email with all these details. So I think I have another meeting, unfortunately, I have to go to, so we're going to have to end in a second. But I can relay any questions that you might have specifically to Neati. And I just wanted to quickly tease our 2 upcoming learning sessions later, this month and one in February. You'll be getting additional info about this if you haven't seen it. So look for a follow-up email, and I want to thank Neati so much for sharing your expertise on this. And as you mentioned in the last slide, hopefully this gives you some great ideas to think about the next time that you meet with your CAC, regardless of where you may be at and what kind of role you have in terms of reviewing spending requests, even if it's something later in the year in the future. We hope that this is just giving you some ideas to think on. So again, thank you, Neati. I really appreciate your time. Thank you everyone for really sharing, being vulnerable and sharing in the chat and sharing on the phone. I really appreciate your time and sharing today. So we will talk to you soon over email. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.